You are most welcome to this talk, and I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Clare Craig to the talk today. Clare, welcome and thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me, John. It's good to see you.
You too. Now, Dr. Clare Craig, medical doctor, you were a consultant pathologist for a while in the NHS, a diagnostic pathologist, a fellow of the Royal College of Pathologists, medical researcher in the clinical data and cancer arm of the 100,000 Genome Project for a while, Clare. You worked on that, fascinating. Medical author, speaker, and generally a campaigner for good things. So I want to do a quick plug, if you don't mind, Clare, to begin with. This is your book here, Expired, the Untold COVID Story. And when I read this, honestly, it was just like scales falling from my eyes. You know, everything just made sense. And I thought, why didn't I see that earlier? You know, Claire's got it all worked out here. So, and we'll put a link, of course, to make sure you avail yourself of a copy. And completely readable, not in medical jargonese. Really interesting.
Thank you.
Background material.
Thank you. I'm glad it worked.
Yeah, it's books are one heck of a lot of work. I've decided never to write anymore, but I know you're working on another one. We might give a spoiler on that later on. So first question, Clare, really is, you know, we heard about this. I suppose we first heard about this late, 2019, and we sort of were given an official narrative, really, of what happened, what was going on. How did your views on the pandemic evolve during 2020, the first year of the pandemic?
Yeah, well, so at the very outset, I think, going along with the crowds. I was absolutely paying attention to what was happening, and I was scared by what was happening. And even when things started to sort of, we started to get a bit more information, we had the Diamond Princess situation. So I started to be a bit less scared for me as an individual, but I was still scared for, the older people that I loved and the society as a whole, and the NHS might collapse. All of that story was still a concern to me. And really that carried on right up until the summertime. So it wasn't until summer 2020 when, the spring wave had ended, and we were still getting this peculiar trickle of cases and deaths every day being reported as if it was all the same as what had gone before. And I was sort of questioning that, but not able to really look into it because I have 4 children and it was summer holidays. And so it wasn't until they went back to school that I thought, right, I'm going to dig out some data on this because I want to understand it better. And the question I had was this trickle of cases just testing errors? Because, as a diagnostic testing expert, that's always a risk you've got with medical testing. You might overdiagnose or underdiagnose, and you've always got to try and get that balance right. And this looked like overdiagnoses. And, you can say that, but you need to prove it. You can't just sort of make that claim. And I thought, well, there will be ways to prove it, because what happened in spring 2020 was kind of characteristic. There were certain people who were more at risk. So you had men died more than women, and black people were more at risk of being in ICU than white people. And, there were sort of all these different signals that were risk factors for COVID deaths and COVID hospitalizations that you could pick out and say, well, does it still look like that now? And so in the summertime, it didn't anymore. The summer it was equal numbers of men and women, and that the pattern had changed. And so even if there were some genuine COVID, knocking around, which is impossible, the bigger picture story at that time was that we were overdiagnosing it. And so having shown that, I thought, well, what do I do about this? Because, I think this is important, and I don't know how to, or who to tell, or how to do something. I don't want to just have it ignored. And I took advice from Carl Hennigan, who's a director of the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine in Oxford, who I was actually at medical school with. And I hadn't been in touch with him for 20 years, but, I knew him. And I asked him what I should do. And he said, well, just write a blog and say it. Put it out there, and then people will know it's been said. And if it's in the public domain, then it can't be ignored in the same way. So I reluctantly took a photograph and set up a social media thing, which all of that stuff I hate. But I did it, and put my name on it and put my face on it and said, I think we've got a problem here. And I was anticipating one of two responses rather naively. I thought either I'm going to be told, well, you're wrong, we've looked at this is actually what's going on and here's why. Or they'd say, oh, that's interesting, we hadn't seen that, we'll see what we can do about it. And I genuinely thought those were the two outcomes. And that's not what happened. I just got attacked. And then also introduced to all sorts of other experts who had had a similar experience when they'd raised a concern, which sort of opened my eyes a little bit to there might be more to this than just my little concern. And so I started reading about it all in much more depth and learning about things that I'd been oblivious about that happened in spring.
Mm-hmm. So being brought up in a life, in a culture where it was allowed to give a point of view and to give some counter argument and to discuss and to work through the dialectic of scientific development. This is how science works. We discuss, we debate, all that seemed to be gone. Your ideas weren't scientifically refuted or scientifically confirmed. It was rather that you were attacked personally. There seems to have been this huge, what I can only call a massive cultural change, really.
Yeah, and I think that there was probably, I don't know exactly what was behind it. I don't know who these people were. But there have been times along the way when it's clear that some of the people who've been causing trouble and attacking people and, trying to discredit them have been funded by outside funders. So it's not just individuals who've got a chip on their shoulder. I think sometimes it's that, but sometimes there's more to it than that. And that's just really, really telling. And obviously that's no way to have a civil society. It's no way to do science. And, it's no way to do politics. You have to actually work on the evidence and argue the cases with facts. And if you are immediately having to go for personal attacks, it's because you haven't got an argument. If you've got the truth on your side, then you just expose it. And there's something quite interesting that I've learned along this way around the difference between a truth and a lie. And so under a lie, I'd include misinterpretations and mistakes and whatever else. And obviously I've made mistakes along the way. When I make a mistake, it goes everywhere. Everybody wants to share it. They want to use it to discredit me. They want to use it so they can show how clever they are because they can show that I was wrong. But most of the things I've said have not been like that. They have been inconvenient truths. And when you say an inconvenient truth, that doesn't happen. You just get attacked.
And I don't want to dwell on this, but I've had, quite serious physical threats from untraceable emails and things like that. There's a real concerted effort against what I would call open discussion. And anyway, let's get on to some really interesting material from your book. Now, you've got a series of beliefs, 12 beliefs. And let's just say these are open for discussion. Mm-hmm. Now, the first belief one, this is the first part of your book. COVID only spreads through close contact.
Yes, that's quite carefully worded.
I'm sure it is. Please tell us what you mean, Claire.
So the story that we were told from the outset was that, if you're up close with somebody that has COVID, you're at risk of catching it from them. And the belief was that people would be almost spitting it in your face. That was the idea, wasn't it? There were droplets coming out of your nose and your mouth as you talked that would be directed at somebody's face, and that is how it would spread. And I said only because I think it can spread like that, right? Close contact can be the problem. But when you actually dig into the story behind where this belief comes from, it's really interesting. So some people stop at the point where they say it was some school project in America by this girl who said that if you had social distancing, you'd be able to, reduce epidemiological spread. This was some, literally a science project at school. But that's not where it really came from. Where it really came from was going way back to 1910. So there was a public health official who worked in Rhode Island, And frankly, I mean, I don't want to completely denigrate this man. I think he did good things, but he also did a few things that we're still having the hangover of. He was a bit of a germaphobe. You know, when you read his book, he talks about how people turn the pages when they've licked their finger, and then he has to touch that page, and then he has to hold the handle in the trolley cart, and other people have been touching it, and there's just bits of other people's saliva everywhere he looks. And so, you know, he's a bit of a character in that way. And he seems to be a bit evangelical about his obsessive compulsive disorder. But what he knew, based on evidence, was that people in hospitals and infectious disease wards that the disease spread was less when you separated the beds a bit. So, you know, that he sort of knew this, and he was really evangelical about it and wanted to make a difference. And it may well be that he did make a difference. But he felt that people weren't listening to him because they still believed that spread could occur through the air. And so this was happening in 1910 now. So we're more than 50 years after germ theory had been accepted as a theory. And that was the result of a difficult scientific debate that became quite heavily politicized between germ theory versus miasma theory. So miasma theory is that theory that bad smells spread disease through the air. And so once they showed that actually it was, these germs, then that theory was shot down. But because it was such a politicized debate, the germ theorists were suppressed with their ideas, and they had to fight and fight for years to be believed. And then when they were believed, they seemed to sort of bring in, it sort of became more extreme. And so when they won, they're like, right, this is it. It's germ theory. All of that miasma stuff is completely wrong because you didn't let us speak. So you must have been wrong about everything. And so when you get into a situation where things are so polarized like that, obviously you lose all the nuance. And so this guy was also losing the nuance. It cannot be miasma theory. He had this phrase, the sewer gas bogey. He wanted to rid the world of this fear of sewer gas being the thing that was spreading disease. So what he then did was he came up with ideas out of thin air. So his idea out of thin air was that it was mouth spray that was the spread of infection, and it would fall within 6 foot of somebody. So he was the originator of that idea of spread through droplets with that distance. And it wasn't evidence-based. And the thing is that when you read his book, he's actually pretty sound. And he ends the book saying, I've made a lot of assumptions here. I've made sweeping statements. I've sort of bundled all the infectious diseases in as one almost. And obviously we've got tons more to learn about this. And, things will evolve as they go along. And he also sort of has a section on influenza where he sort of, he struggles with that one a bit. It doesn't really fit his model the way the others do. So, I actually respect him a lot. And so we can't really put the blame on him when more than 100 years later.
So this is Dr. Kaplan, is it?
Yeah, this is Charles Chapin. Yeah, we haven't done the work in the meantime, and so it's not on him, it's on us, right? He came up with a hypothesis and nobody's really shot it down. And actually, that's not true. People have shot this down, but they've always been ignored. So physicists who would look at aerosols and droplets and how they move through the air had said for a long time, we've got a problem here, guys, because this mouth spray is on a trajectory. It's coming out, but it's immediately under the influence of gravity. And so if you're standing opposite somebody, the chance of it hitting a mucosal membrane, like an eye, nostril or mouth, it's just minuscule. It's just not going to happen. And we know that because we feel it when it does happen. It's very, very rare. And that's not how this could possibly be spreading. And there were other physicists who did this work who sort of started off working in air pollution and then got interested in, in epidemiology and how viruses spread, who were trying to raise the alert from early in 2020, saying, look, you've got this wrong. So they were sort of absolutely baffled that the epidemiology community had this idea that anything infectious was falling to the ground as if it was incredibly heavy and was just going to drop, when they knew that the size of the particles that viruses are in is teeny tiny. And they're so tiny that they do something that's sort of slightly mind-blowing. So if you get really high-resolution photography, you can see that anything that is visible to the naked eye, even the tiniest thing visible to the naked eye, is immediately under the effect of gravity, so it falls. But just anything just below what's visible to the naked eye doesn't do that. It's sort of mind-blowing, but it doesn't do that, because as soon as it's out of your nose and your mouth, it starts to rapidly evaporate and becomes significantly smaller. And it's also in the warm air from our body, and so it goes up. So it's not falling to the ground at all. It's going up and it's lingering in the air. And so the kind of image I have of it is like Pigpen from Charlie Brown, where people are surrounded by this cloud of aerosols that they're producing all of the time, and they're being left behind as they walk down the street. And it then can move through the air from place to place. And so, what that means is that somebody who's very sick at home and producing literally millions of virus particles, and tens of millions overnight, that material will get into the general air. And if it's at night time, there is no UV light around to do anything about it, it will move to their neighbours. And we've seen that happen with SARS-1. So there was a nice study in SARS-1 of an apartment block in Hong Kong where there were 6 tower blocks arranged in a sort of hexagon arrangement, and physicists predicted, based on people who were infected in the ground floor flats of one block, who was going to be infected next in the upstairs flats of blocks in the wind direction, and they got it right, because that's how it spread.
It's so interesting for the development of just scientific ideas. So this miasma idea, where things like spread through the air, so you could smell putrid smells 100 yards away, and the disease spreads in these putrid smells. Well, of course, we know it doesn't. This is what germ theory has taken over. But from that idea, we had this stereotypical idea of droplet infection. I mean, that's what we call it. These droplets, and they drop out. And the idea that disease could spread through the air had been chucked out in the sort of 1880s or whatever it was, with Louis Pasteur and Philippe Semmelweis. Therefore, that can't possibly happen. But the physicists tell us about these aerosol particles.
Yes.
But they are spreading through the air.
Yes.
So the miasma theory wasn't completely wrong in that sense.
No,
we've gone to the opposite.
Wrong. Yeah, that's right. So, I think the fact it was a smell was wrong. It was wrong. It wasn't a smell. But
Correct.
The idea that therefore nothing could ever travel through the air is also wrong. And once you've understood this principle, all sorts of things start to fall into place. So you start to understand why every region at the same time's got a problem. This is not what the modelling showed. The modelling showed it would start in sort of focal areas, largely cities, but they couldn't predict where it would begin, and it would spread out to more remote regions over time. And the modelling was suggesting that would take weeks and weeks, like 14 weeks, to reach a peak in every point of the country. Now that is nothing like what happened in the real world anywhere. In the real world, it was switched on almost immediately across huge areas. But if you look across continents, you can see sort of time differences as it moved across. So, for instance, in spring 2020, Eastern Europe didn't have a problem, as if it had perhaps either already gone or their kind of winter virus season was over. And then it spread from Italy to us in Sweden to, it kind of went slightly west. And then in the following year, we had a much earlier autumn, January, first COVID winter, nothing in spring. And it was Eastern Europe that was hit in the spring. So it was starting to move in the opposite direction across the continent. So, when you're seeing it as being spread in aerosols through the air, it starts to make sense. And one of the other things the modelers had set out as a claim was that the peak would be in spring 2020. They reckoned the peak would be in July. That was what they were modelling. They thought everyone was susceptible. It would carry on spreading and spreading and spreading. It would peak in July, and that their interventions would squash the curve, slow the spread, and delay that peak to after July. Well, it peaked in April. It peaked in April. And then when they reduced the restrictions, the modeler said, oh, we'll have a rebound. Every time we relax, there's going to be a rebound, and we're going to have to keep intervening to keep it under control. There was no rebound. It peaked, and then it went away, and then it comes back in a seasonal manner subsequently.
Yeah. So many fascinating things there again, Claire. The sheer human arrogance, really, that we can control a virus, which are these forces of nature. I mean, viruses, we need them for the ecosystem, of course, but in some cases they go wrong and become pathological. But, you know, human beings, we're so clever, we can sort this out. You know, the arrogance of that is quite incredible. And this simplistic idea that, to put it quite crudely, A slobbers on B, who slobbers on C, who slobbers on D. Simplistic beyond description. And as we've said, an antithesis against this miasma theory.
And we had evidence very early on that wasn't the case, you know. So if you remember the stories of the choir rehearsals and the restaurants with the air conditioning and the buses, you know, it was clearly not just people who were in the very close vicinity face to face with people, and yet that was all just ignored and suppressed, and the people who were saying it spreads through aerosols were called misinformation spreaders by the WHO. So you know, it's all part of a pattern, really, isn't it?
This is airborne, as in paratroopers.
Yeah.
To misquote a head of an international organisation. And then we have these fascinating ideas that don't quite fit in with the theory. So, I mean, I've had emails from people that are really displeased that they've got the disease. I remember one from someone who was in the outback and said, "Oh, I'm in the outback. I went into town once 2 weeks ago, and now I've got the virus. You know, what's this about? You know, they thought they shouldn't have it." And we have these weird ideas of, I think there's an episode of people on the British Antarctic Survey got an infection when they shouldn't get infections, and people who've been on ships at sea, and all of a sudden the infection seems to come along. So the way, another way science works is we look for the exception. Surely we should look for the exception and say, look, this doesn't work in that case, therefore does this count to cast doubt on the whole theory, on the whole way of thinking? And that just doesn't seem to have been done.
No, I completely agree. And I think those are important stories. And I think, you know, people sort of dismiss them because, I don't know, there are small numbers of people involved in those stories. But they do, you know, they do prove that the conventional theory is not right, or at least not right in every case. You know, there are exceptions where you have these very odd stories. So, you know, they were talking about that Argentinian fishing vessel, which was was at sea for 5 weeks and then had an outbreak. And then the British Antarctic Survey, they had tested and isolated and flown to Argentina and tested and isolated and stayed in a hotel just then and went to the base, and then we had an outbreak anyway. And so, you know, that does suggest that there's more to this story than the conventional story of you've got the lurgy and you're going to give it to me. And I think the other part, sort of sliding onto belief too, I think, but the other critical point of that was a mistake was thinking everybody was susceptible. And that's a belief that sort of somehow still seems to hold. And that was the belief that leads to this sort of tsunami model where it keeps going and going and going until everybody's caught it. And that happened nowhere at any point. Yeah. And, you know, we've seen so many COVID waves. It's very predictable how long it takes before they peak naturally. We know that from evidence everywhere. And this is really, really important, because I suppose at a stretch, if you pretended this virus was something we knew nothing about, you could say we didn't know that until that had happened. But it's not something we knew nothing about. We knew it's a coronavirus, and we knew that they are very seasonal, and they do have these sometimes quite, you know, dramatic surges before they go away again. So we did know that, and we don't know as much about coronaviruses as we do about influenza. But influenza viruses are, you know, also respiratory viruses which are very seasonal. So we could have thought, well, what do we know about influenza? And what we knew about that is that they only about 5 to 15% are susceptible to any sort of influenza variant, as it were. And if you look at papers from before this period, where people were talking about what would happen if we had an influenza, that was mutated and that was unfamiliar, and what would the outcome be. In fact, there was one that was written about influenza that had been a lab leak, a sort of gain of function influenza. What would happen? And the basis of that thesis was, well, maximum 15% are going to be susceptible. I think, well, that's a very sound reasoning. So why on earth were people talking about it being 85%? This is an extraordinary difference, really extraordinary. And there is a problem we have that modelers, first of all, their entire career is about this sort of event. So they want to spin it out and exaggerate. The worse they can make it, the better it is for them. They become the heroes, as it were. So they've got all the wrong motivations. And on top of that, if they say 85% are going to be susceptible and they've got it wrong, there doesn't seem to be any consequence for them. If they said, oh, don't worry about this, nobody's susceptible, that's when they have a consequence because they've undercalled it. So they have this perverse incentive to always be massively overcalling it. And it's the politicians who take the flak for overreacting, but the politicians didn't seem to have the common sense, frankly, to question these people. And I think that's really sad. It's almost as if they were being bamboozled with computer models, when actually the question was very, very simple. Anybody could have an opinion on how many people are going to get it, how many people are going to die of it. It's two numbers. You don't need a computer model. That's a very simple back of the envelope sum. And so you can then, as a politician, interrogate those two questions, but nobody really did.
The modelling disasters in the pandemic, we could spend a long time talking about that. Assumptions based on essentially no information at all, fed to politicians with essentially no background science at all, who were not equipped to ask the sort of scientific questions that would have interrogated this data or this apparent data in an analytical format. So what we're saying here, just to clarify the science, Claire, is that in any one wave, let's take the Wuhan wave, the original virus, whatever we want to call that. What we're saying is only a small number of the population would actually be susceptible to becoming infected and getting sick with that virus. Is that what with that particular form of the virus? Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we're saying. That if you look. There's something slightly odd about what happens that nobody really can explain. And I think that's been part of the problem, is nobody willing to talk about things we can't explain, pretending there's no doubt in the situation. So one of the things we can't explain is peak deaths are always in January, right? Respiratory virus peak deaths always happen in January. Now, if viral spread was to do with how we're interacting with each other, that wouldn't be the case. It would come and go much more randomly, and it wouldn't be predictably always in January. Now, it isn't only always in January. The other peaks are predictable as well. So if there is an autumn wave, which we have had every time, then you see the peak deaths at the end of October, beginning of November. If you have a spring one, you see peak deaths in early April. And if there's a summer one, peak deaths are in July. We haven't seen peak deaths that are falling outside of that pattern. So if you can see that pattern, then you'll say, well, why is it that it's always going to be falling in November, as we've just seen, before rising in December? Like every single year it has fallen in November before it rises in December. So that is tricky, because if you try and model it on anything to do with viral spread as we know it, that doesn't fall out. And so, but if you think about it as being human susceptibility, then you get that predictable pattern. So we've got something causing a wave of susceptibility at certain times of the year with predictable peaks, and we can't explain what it is. So something causes a fraction of the population to become susceptible, and whatever variant is around at the time is the one that will be going with that. And that's why the peaks are predictable. And the reason I say that, because that is quite a sort of mind-blowing way to think about it compared with what people normally think. But one of the points of evidence to support that is this. If you looked at people who are in hospital, you've got two types of people in hospital. You've got the ones who had COVID, got sick, and came through A&E. So they're the sort of proper COVID admissions from the community. And then you have people who are in hospital for other reasons who catch it in hospital. Now, the conventional story would mean that you had a peak of admissions from the community first, and then it spreads in the hospital, and you have your incubation period, and then you get peak, oh, we've got these patients in hospital catching it now. So your hospital cases would be after peak admissions. But what actually happens is that the cases in hospital peak at the same time as they peak in the community, before the admissions. So the cases are already falling in hospital before you've got peak virus in the hospital. So that suggests there's a susceptibility thing going on in the community that's also affecting all the hospital patients. And of course, hospital patients are sick, so their immune systems are already struggling, and so their percentage of people in the hospital environment that are going to end up positive is going to be higher than in a community environment, but the timing of it is the same.
So interesting. So there's something about the time of the year, the ecosystem of the planet that we live in, us as human beings and all the multiple factors that influence our susceptibility to the virus, interacting with the innate biology of the virus in its ecosystem. That means that this is highly seasonal.
Yes.
And the cases tend to move as a wave, almost like pieces of wood drifting down a river or something. They're all moving, kind of moving together.
Yeah, and I mean, that's true, and it's complicated. You know, that's the point. There's a lot of factors at play that we can't pretend to understand, and pretending to understand it has just made everyone look stupid. Mm-hmm. And one lovely analogy that I quite like is to say it's a bit like tomato blight, where, you know, everything's fine in your allotment, it's all going well, and then overnight they're all gone. They've all just, like, the conditions are such in the environment that suddenly this fungus that was around gets the opportunity to just take off, and all the tomatoes are gone. And I think if you understand it that way, you can also understand why some of these periods, like spring 2021 here, you don't see a wave. And obviously that was attributed at the time to vaccine success, but it was the same in Portugal and Ireland. I think it was a geographical phenomenon where the very westerly part of Europe didn't have a spring 2021 wave, and Eastern Europe had it badly, in the reverse of what was seen in 2020.
Yeah. So any one wave, only about 15% of people are susceptible. So the modelers got the inverse wrong. The modelers were saying it's 85%.
Yes.
Whereas actually 85% that probably weren't susceptible in any meaningful way.
Exactly the wrong way around. Yeah, most people are bystanders, really.
It's dazzling how wrong they got this. And yet
absolutely.
The whole policy was based on these particular papers from particular individuals who happened to breach the lockdown themselves from particular institutions. It's just incredible that so much weight was put on such tenuous, exiguous evidence. It's mind-blowing.
Worse, that it wasn't revised. That's the worst crime. Okay, make a mistake. We all make mistakes, right? But at what point did they say, oh, look, now we've got some actual evidence of how it actually behaves in the real world, let's revise this? And they failed to do that, which is just catastrophic. I think one of the things that people haven't talked about much at all, which is very, very telling, is this measure called the secondary attack rate. So the secondary attack rate is a measure of how many people in a household will catch COVID when somebody in the house has got it. And you can see in the literature, you see huge variation in the claims on this. And that's largely because a lot of people don't take the care to ensure that they're not including people who caught it at the same time as each other. So if we've got 6 people in our house. So when my husband and I were out and caught it, we brought it home, and then there was a period, and then 2 of my children were ill. So our secondary attack rate was, of the 4 children, 2 of them were ill. So it was 50%. But if you look at that over the whole population, Public Health England were very careful about how they measured it and wouldn't have included me and my husband in the sum. They got 10%. It was 10% for the Wuhan wave. It was 10% for the Alpha wave. Now, after Alpha, a large number of people vaccinated. And so at that point, you'd think, well, it should have reduced the number who are susceptible. It should be less than 10%. It was 10% for the Delta wave.
Exactly the same.
Pattern. And worse, like the thing that really hasn't been talked about is it was 10% for that first Omicron wave. And the thing is that this does not add up, because the other data on Omicron so the PCR positives say were huge numbers. And the public health data on the number of people that developed antibodies also suggested huge numbers of cases. But I don't understand how they came to those numbers if only 10% were susceptible. Like, there's something that doesn't add up. And they stopped publishing that figure subsequently. So from March 2022, we haven't had that figure.
So the confusion is that you and your daughter could have been out, both caught the virus, maybe at different places, but at the same time, compared to the fact that maybe you could have caught it and then passed it on to your daughter, and this nuance wasn't really taken into account in the calculations of the secondary attack rate.
It was more the point that, say, if my husband and I had gone out and both caught it at the same time, we're both index cases, and so we shouldn't be counted in each other's secondary attack rate. That was the math, yeah.
Got it. This 10 to 15% susceptibility, Claire, is this consistent with other diseases? How does this compare to influenza, for example? Do we know?
Yeah, so for influenza, it's 5 to 15%. For measles, it's it is something like over 85%. It'll be 90%. So that was the model they were using. They were using this model of measles and hypothetical scary virus that they do all their modelling on, because that's their career. As I was saying earlier, they pitch their work to funders on the basis that they can tell you about scary viruses. So their models are based on this hypothetical scary thing that doesn't probably exist, because otherwise, who cares? Right, what are you going to do about it otherwise? So the
model becomes an irrelevance.
Yeah, they have to come up with stories that give them relevance. And the stories that give them relevance are, these things can spread to everybody, they can be lethal, and we can do something about them. You have to have all three for their careers to be relevant.
I mean, I'm not a virologist, but I certainly know that the coronaviruses and the measles viruses are completely, utterly different types of infection. I think probably in our culture as well, we have ideas of plague. Certainly I was brought up with ideas of plague, 1348, the Black Death, 1666. We have this sort of culture in our background, this underlying fear. And of course, in the medical world, I've been teaching about 1918 pandemic for decades. And I guess we were sort of expecting it to fall into that category.
Yeah, so I think these things are really, really interesting, because they are sort of these they're so frightening and so far away that they are sort of myths of our time. They've become myths of our time, and we can't go back to Black Death and plague and actually pick apart what was really going on. Whether people were really well nourished at the time, whether the consequences of people's fear around those things were part of the problem, we don't know. But for 1918, we know a lot, actually, and what we know is a lot different to what we were told. So what we know is that what we're told is contradictory in the first place. So we're told a third of the world caught it, and that the fatality rate was 2 to 3%, and that the number of deaths was absolutely enormous. So the Wellcome Trust currently claim 100 million people died, which is just, I can't remember how many people were alive at the time. I think it was
about 400 million probably.
Right. So, it's a ridiculous claim. Those three numbers don't add up. They don't add up.
There's probably more than that, but you're right, the numbers don't add up.
No, and if you go back to what people were saying at the time, they had pretty good record keeping in 1918. They knew who had died.
Yeah, of course.
And it was modelers in 1920 who were made the assumption that the problems seen in Europe and America could be extrapolated to the whole world. And that based on that assumption, and then also assuming that the whole world will have dealt with it in a much worse way, so they'll have a higher mortality, they came up with a figure of 20 million deaths. So why in 1920 were they, exaggerating the problem and coming up with 20 million deaths? And by this, 2020, they're saying it was 100 million. It's because over the course of the last 100 years, people whose careers depend on there having been something scary in 1918 have inflated that number 5-fold. Now, if you go back to the 1920 modelers, we can now say to them, look, nothing happened in China. Nothing happened in Japan. Your assumptions were wrong. It could not have been 20 million. I'm not saying people didn't die, right? They did die. Yeah. But it was not the way the story is told. And one of the interesting, there's several reasons why they might have died more than for a regular flu. And the thing is that the 1918 flu continued to circulate, still around, but it stopped killing people. So why did it kill people then? And obviously there were people who were really, really, really malnourished at the time. There'd just been the war, the soldiers were living in unsanitary conditions, marching, exhausted and vulnerable to infection. There were people who'd been working in munitions factories back home and exposed to all sorts of chemicals, or just living nearby these munitions factories. So that might well have played a role, I don't know. But one story that does seem to have a good evidence base behind it is that there was a huge amount of hope based on the treatment of aspirin. Aspirin was this new drug at the time. They knew it reduced fevers, and they thought that this was the way they were going to get through this. And people were chucking down aspirin in really toxic quantities. There were sort of people describing what was going on with young people who were sick with the fever, but then being given handfuls of aspirin because they were so frightened that they might die. And then if you look at how people died, there were two ways people died. The people have described this very well. There was people who died because they had a viral infection that turned into a secondary bacterial pneumonia. Yeah. There were no antibiotics and they died. There were other people who got sick very quickly, turned blue, had this very characteristic heliotrope cyanosis, they called it, on the lips. They ended up with really edematous, heavy, wet, red lungs at post-mortem. This is not the same condition. That looks much more like aspirin toxicity. So the response to 1918 seems to have been a lot of what happened. It wasn't just what we're told.
It's just so interesting, Claire. I had no idea about that aspirin toxicity affecting the lungs and causing the lungs became inflamed and edematous. They weren't taking in the oxygen, and that caused so basically, how did you describe it? Cyanosis around the mouth, isn't it? The blueness around the mouth.
Yeah, so they get, which obviously you can get cyanosis with pneumonias as well, but this was characteristic. They gave it a name. It was different looking to what they were used to seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would call that central cyanosis, which of course is the most alarming form of cyanosis. It means the oxygen levels in the blood have dropped quite dramatically. That is so interesting. So many things we can learn from the past. And the other thing, just going back to the start of this discussion, really was this idea that consensus of medical opinion got things wrong, taking the example of aerosolization for over 100 years, well over 100 years. We're talking, dates Louis Pasteur, we're probably talking about 1890s and those kind of times. And yet, in 2020, the thinking had not been clarified. It's quite incredible the way these myths can be perpetuated.
It is, isn't it? And it's this whole thing around the institutional aspect of science where people, they sort of have a power base based on the knowledge that they got into that position with. And anybody undermining the knowledge that they've built their own little empire on is a threat to them. And, you can see this through scientist history all the way along. There's always, you have Hooke and Newton and their disputes and how that played out politically. And there's that, Max Planck's expression of science progresses one funeral at a time. The trouble is that we haven't had funerals in the same way. Fauci has been in charge of the NIAID in the US for literally the length of people's entire careers. And so you're not getting the turnaround, you're not getting the new knowledge and the fresh blood and the young thinking coming through ever. And instead we've got this sort of entrenchment, and we've got medical journals and scientific journals who have been influenced by money and sort of not rocking the boat. And so the whole point of science is to have debate and questions and openness. And if you can't have openness, if there are things that are off the table, you won't find out things that, you won't get near the truth. If you have a culture of openness, which we've had in the past, you have wacky ideas floating around. That's just what happens. So you have people like Marie Curie, who we all, praise for her important work in physics, but she also was into seances and things like that. And you have, other scientists of the time who similarly made amazing breakthroughs that had sort of funny ideas about the effects of magnetism and hypnosis. And, because everything was on the table. So you could talk about these things, and over time, some of the things you were talking about have come out the other way and have been disproved, which is fine. As long as you adapt your thinking as the evidence emerges, that should be fine. But it's not the culture.
Isaac Newton spent as much time trying to work out when the Lord was going to return from numbers in Scripture, I believe, as he did from actually working on physics. But that's not the point. He had a very fertile brain, that he was thinking aloud. And as well as that, there's vested interests actually work to maintain the status quo now, I believe, financial vested interests. I mean, Barry Marshall springs to mind in Australia. Everyone knows that stomach ulcers are caused by stress, and you have to take an anti-acid tablet every day for the rest of your life, supplied by a pharmaceutical company at significant cost. But take that one a day for the rest of your life, and you'll be absolutely fine. Then when Barry Marshall comes along and says, no, just a minute, most of these are caused by a bacteria, Helicobacter pylori. Mm-hmm. And you know what? I know how to eradicate that. And, he wasn't welcome with open arms, shall we say. And it was only when he actually infected himself and was able to treat himself that he demonstrated that this actually worked, because people did not want the change. And revolutionary ideas, make no mistake, are not allowed. You must just have little incremental thoughts. You must not get into trouble. You must make sure it gets published. You must keep the income coming in. And we don't want any revolutionary ideas that could actually improve human knowledge in this sort of dialectic fashion. It's a very sad situation.
It is sad, and it is sad because the people who have created that situation obviously feel threatened by new knowledge. What's sad is that they feel threatened by it. They're not threatened by it. They really are not, and yet they feel like they are. I think, well, where do you get that weakness from? Why are you so weak that you can't actually engage in something that might be amazing? You just won't engage.
It's scientific Ludditism, really, isn't it? This is the way we've done it, and we're not going to change. And sit down, young man, sit down, young woman. We don't want to hear from you. It's
Yeah. And of course that actually plays back into that story about the droplets and the aerosols, because you've got a situation where in the 1930s they'd got the photography up to a standard that meant they could actually sort of start to observe these things. And a lot of work was done by engineer William Wells and his physician wife Mildred on what was really happening in terms of droplets and aerosols, and how big and how far and how long they'd stay in the air. And they did amazing work that was dismissed by the CDC director, Alexander Langmuir, at the time, because he was thinking this was a threat to germ theory, the same old problem. This sounds a bit like my asthma, I'm going to dismiss you. And he stayed...
And this is 1920s, Claire, from memory.
So I think the work was in the 1930s, but it wasn't until the 1980s, late 1980s, when Alexander Langmuir retired. And in his retirement speech, he said, I got it wrong about those two. that actually their evidence was really good, and we ought to be looking at that properly. So people started to look at it properly 50 years on.
So I got it wrong all the time I was in power, all the time I was decision maker. Got it wrong.
Well,
Now I'm retiring.
Now
I'm retiring. Now I'm retiring. I'll admit it now.
Yeah, well, that is what happened, and you can see how you can see that reflected time and time again with powerful positions, people in science. And so he admitted it, and then there was this catastrophic error where people were looking back at the work of these two people to find the number that's of the size of a droplet that would fall to the ground. And they misinterpreted the meaning of the word airborne, because airborne, to us now, anybody says airborne means it travels through the air. Everybody understands that to be its meaning. But when they were using it in the 30s and 40s, airborne meant infectious material of a size that could be spread through the air. So you would use that word airborne to say, well, it's small enough that it could cause an infection, rather than it's small enough that's the size it is in the air. Does that make sense? I'm not saying it brilliantly. I'll try again. So after they did their work, generally they focused on TB, and TB is interesting because it, like measles, can't spread in the upper airways. There are no receptors. So any aerosol that you breathe in that's going to end up caught in the upper airways will have no impact on you. It's only the aerosols that are small enough that can get deep into the lungs that can cause an infection.
The microparticulates go deep down.
Yeah. So these tinier aerosols that could cause an infection, they were describing as airborne, meaning they could cause an infection. Whereas obviously we misinterpret that now, and so the claim became that these teeny tiny aerosols were the ones that were dropping to the ground, when that wasn't the case at all. It was far bigger, the ones that were dropping to the ground.
Right, so very small aerosols, very small particles. It's the same as particles of diesel smoke or wood smoke. They can go straight down into the lungs, and they can cause infection, because measles, as you say, doesn't affect the upper airways. It's got to be these small particles. So big, if someone's slobbering on you with great big droplets, theoretically the risk from measles would be less. It wouldn't quite work like that, because every time someone's breathing out, there's a whole variety of sizes of droplets.
That's right.
Produced. So people would catch measles by direct contact, but they can also catch it through this airborne. And airborne then was used to define. Airborne was defined pragmatically. It's what is capable of transmitting infection. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really weird to us, isn't it? Because the word is so discrete in its meaning now. It's hard to understand it having that other meaning, because it just sounds so peculiar. But they did use it to mean something completely different to what we mean now. And so this wrong number ended up in the textbooks, ended up in all the public health guidelines. And people were still absolute about it, even when physicists today are saying, this is rubbish. You're just talking rubbish. That's not what happens. These things do not drop to the ground. It's just, and I try in the book to describe it by making everything 1,000 times bigger and talking about giants. And so you've got these giants in the air, and the claim is that they're breathing out grapefruit-sized things and lentil-sized things. Yeah. And that in reality, the grapefruit-sized things are going to drop to the ground in about the radius of their height. So they're a mile high, and within a mile, your grapefruits are on the ground. And they're saying that that's going to happen to these tiny lentil-sized aerosols, that they're all just going to come thundering down to the ground. And when you can sort of picture that, you see how ridiculous that is, a mile.
It's just ludicrous conflation.
But it's people find it very hard to picture these tiny things. Yeah. And so you can't kind of see how ridiculous the concept is, because it's all just too small to think about. Yeah.
But that's what scientists are supposed to do. They're supposed to analyse the nature of reality and the practical applications in terms of the pandemic for that misunderstanding, Claire. Can you just sort of spell that out for me a bit?
Well, yeah. So if you think back to the kinds of restrictions that were in place, we had one-way systems and perspex screens. And, the perspex screens were counterproductive, because if you've got aerosols in the air, the perspex screens cause them to collect, so that you're getting a higher dosage than you otherwise would do if you had proper airflow through a room. So, they were completely counterproductive. And you had all the social distancing that just caused horrible harm in terms of people being allowed to be with other people when they needed to be. And then, of course, the masks come into play, right? So if you believe spread is through droplets that are being spat out of somebody's mouth as they talk, then a mask is going to help. It's going to help. I accept that. But if you realise that's not how it spreads, then you've got two problems. One problem is the gaps all around the cloth mask, where that's actually where the air's going in and out, so it has no impact at all. But the other problem is anything that you are spitting onto the mask, you're then breathing over it. So you're going to aerosolise what's on the mask. And if you look at the data in the real world of what happened when masking mandates were brought in, every single time there was a difference between one region and another, or one country and another, it was always the masked one that was doing worse.
Interesting. Yeah. One thing I'm just a bit confused about, someone who was, say, 10-15% was susceptible to the Wuhan wave, would it be a different 10 to 15% that was susceptible to the Alpha wave, and a different 10 to 15% that could be susceptible to the Delta wave and the Omicron wave?
Yeah, no, that's a really important question. And the answer is essentially yes. It's sort of working its way through the population, which is what influenza would have done as well. So you'd see with influenza from way back, 1930s, you could measure antibodies and you would see how a fraction each year would be accumulating these antibodies. And then you'd have one particular influenza variant that might skip a year, and then it comes back again. And so after like 10 to 11 years, it's worked its way through the population. And then you get this new strain of influenza. And everybody goes into a bit of a panic again and says, oh, nobody's seen this one, it's going to be worse. And then it does its thing and it works its way through as before. So yes, it is working its way through. And you can see that with the antibody results and how they just keep increasing over time. We haven't had periods where they've fallen away. The antibodies just increase, and once you've got antibodies from an infection, if you were unvaccinated, you're sort of pretty much okay. So there was, for Delta, the previously infected were very well protected. They were very well protected from hospitalizations and deaths. That didn't really happen if you'd had a previous infection, and they were almost completely protected from infection. So 99% of the infections were first timers, and there was a trickle of people who'd been positive before, some of whom may have been asymptomatic positives. Well, was that ever really a positive? I don't think so. But with Omicron, that changed a little bit, but it was still 95% were first timers. So there were some people who were becoming infected again. But the people who seem to have had the most infections with Omicron have been people who've had the most doses of the vaccine. So, that Cleveland study of healthcare workers, where the more doses they had, the higher the infection rate. And when they went and checked and said, well, is this a testing bias? No, it wasn't. Is it a bias because the people who've stopped being injected because they've had it? It wasn't that either. It was literally the vaccine was making people's immune systems respond worse, and they were getting infected more often.
And the immunologists do tell us that this is a well-recognised phenomena, that the vaccine can stimulate the suppressor cells and stimulate particular types of antibodies which generate immune tolerance. It's well-recognised.
I mean, it's a potentially big problem, because you've got the immune systems that have switched from being on attack mode. So even you think your immune system's got two jobs really. It has to recognise you as self and ignore it, and it has to recognise foreign. But it has to make an exception for food, because food is in you and it's foreign, and you don't want to have an allergic response to it. So it has a way of saying, well, let's switch our immune response to say, yeah, it's foreign, but foreign, and we can ignore it. And that's what's been happening with people who've been injected multiple times, is their body is saying, well, this is foreign, but we can ignore it. And we don't want to be ignoring this. It's a foreign virus. You shouldn't be ignoring it. And then there's the additional problem, of course, that of that sort of original antigenic sin story, where once your immune system's been trained on one particular way of approaching a pathogen, so one particular, if it's trained up to say, it looks like this, and in the case of the vaccine, this little bit looks like this, then every time it sees that virus, it's going to approach it with the weapons it learnt in the first lesson. And so everybody who got vaccinated were taught the same lesson. So the virus has then got immense sort of pressure to evolve to avoid that technique specifically, because then it's adapted and can run through that population, which is what it's done subsequently. Whereas, if you allow natural immunity to develop, then it's a broad range of immunity in an individual and even broader across the population, and it doesn't have so much of a chance of sort of finding that niche and going for it.
Yeah, so the idea that specific vaccination is a kind of an evolutionary driver, really. Whereas if you've got natural immunity, you're going to produce an immune response, whether it's through T cells or antibodies to, I don't know, at least 20 different proteins, 20 different epitopes from the virus. You get this polyclonal.
That's right.
Polyclonal response. So the high numbers of antibodies in the community that were cited, people like the Office for National Statistics, were well up into the sort of high 90s of percents. Is that credible given the accumulation of repeated infections that people were, or the virus that people were exposed to, or is there something that's slightly inconsistent with those very high levels of antibodies?
So there's something about it that I just don't quite buy. So I think they were doing a really good measure through Wuhan Alpha and Delta wave. And you look at the number of people who were said to, like, they were looking at blood donors but extrapolating to the population, and if you say, well, if that proportion of the population have now had COVID, it actually tallied very well with the number of symptomatic people who had tested positive. So you've got a measure, if you've got two measures of the same thing and they're coming out the same, that's pretty compelling. And it was also, similar fraction to the proportion who were susceptible in a household. So everything was aligned, it was all making sense. But then with Omicron, they all fall apart and they're not aligned anymore. And one thing that sort of came out during the course of the Delta wave was evidence from the Moderna trial. It was just one study where they showed that people who had been vaccinated and then had an infection didn't produce N antibodies, these sort of post-infection antibodies, at the same rate as the unvaccinated. It was sort of half, or less than half. So that would mean that you could have the same number of infections in a vaccinated community, but with an antibody test, it would look like there'd only been half those number of infections. And I just wonder if the public health people decided to fiddle with their testing and say, well, we've got to account for this. Let's have a much, much lower threshold of how much antibody needs to be there for us to say it's real. Because it was around that time that it all seemed to go a bit haywire. And when the sort of one other way I've had a sort of finger in the air, is this correct, is just to ask people. So I've done, polls on Twitter and just said, have you had it? It's a very, are you vaccinated, aren't you vaccinated, have you had it? Just simple questions. And I've done that more than once over time, and it's very consistent. And it changes over time in a predictable fashion. But the answers to those surveys fit with 10% at a time, not with everybody's had it, now it's over. And it's clearly not over. At the moment, Finland has got a higher hospitalisation rate than they've ever had. Right, so, it's coming back. It's going to surge in December here like it does every year. It's not over because it hasn't worked its way through the population. And if you speak to people, you'll know people who haven't had it yet, because not everybody has. Quite a few people have had it multiple times, but there's still plenty of people who haven't had it yet. And there seems to be a pattern that the older you are, the less likely you are to have had it. And I think that makes perfect sense, because our immune systems educate themselves through the course of our lives. Now, of course, there comes a point in life when you're quite close to death, when your immune systems fail and you're going to be more susceptible to everything and anything. But before that happens, when you're still, healthy, then you've got a very educated immune system at 80 compared to at 20 years old. And if you look at the antibody levels across those age groups, throughout the whole period, there's always been, every 10 years older, there were fewer people had developed antibodies. There'd been fewer infections for every 10-year gap. And so you can make an argument about shielding, and you can make an argument about young people having a whale of a time, but you shouldn't be seeing a gap between 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds and 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds. That's because of prior education of the immune system, which means
cross immunity, basically, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so it makes sense, but it does mean that the age groups who are susceptible going forward are not necessarily the ones that were at the beginning, as it's working its way through.
Because there's these other coronaviruses that are around. There's other viruses which have got probably similar shaped proteins on the surface, these epitopes. There's going to be cross immunity.
I mean, do you remember that study early on with measles and the MMR immunity? That was a fascinating study where they
tell us, please.
So they looked at, this is like 2020 data, and they'd looked at how sick people had become and who'd got infected, and found that people who had antibodies to mumps were protected, and people who had antibodies to mumps from their MMR vaccine had the best protection of all. And it was really a very effective vaccine, and it was a vaccine that we had tons of safety data on, and yet having shown how protective it was, they didn't want to do anything with it because we had to have novel products being given to everybody for some reason. So that was just ridiculous, because it was such a clear-cut improvement in protection. And that just goes to show also that there's this sort of belief some people seem to have that our immune systems have got a clipboard with the tick boxes for each disease you've had. You've had that one, had that one. And it's not like that. What happens is the pathogen's chopped up into multitude of tiny, tiny fragments, and all your body is doing is saying, that's not me. That is foreign, that bit there. But that bit there being foreign is just simply the shape it's in. And the shape of a tiny fragment of mumps can look very similar to the shape of a tiny fragment of a SARS-CoV-2.
Yeah, we have this idea that, I talk to my students that the immunity is specific. You make a specific immune response against a specific organism. But that's simplistic because, as you say, organisms are not, the immune system doesn't say, oh, well, that's the virus, that's the measles, that's the mumps, that's the rubella. It's actually looking at the molecules on the surface of that, the subcomponents of that.
And so I suppose the counter is that if you have had, if you didn't have protection from the other things you've seen previously, then you have an infection, and then you're able to demonstrate that you've had the full immune response to the whole thing, and you can say, yes, you've had that infection. We can show it in your immune response. So I guess it's a bit of both. On the one hand, you don't need to have seen that exact thing before to have some protection, but on the other hand, having seen that thing, you can measure it using things in the immune system.
And yet we were told this is a novel virus. To this we have no immunity, we have no resistance. This is something completely new. Yeah. Which, looking back, is just ludicrous.
Yeah, and I think would be ludicrous actually for any pathogen, because because your body recognises it as foreign, not recognises it because it's seen it before.
Yeah, but all life on the planet is basically the same. There's the same genetic code, the same amino acids making up proteins. And that there is similarity between the shapes. I mean, we go back to Edward Jenner, who inoculated this poor boy James Phipps with cowpox. And I don't want to go into that story now in detail. I know we've got views on that, but the idea is that the cowpox gave cross immunity to the smallpox. It's a different but similar.
Yeah, I think that's a useful concept to explain that situation.
Yeah. I was looking at you with some anxiety there because I know that's a separate topic. So I want to finish shortly, Claire, because we've done so much. But can you just clarify that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, was that providing protection against COVID?
Yeah, it was. It was.
So it's the mumps component of it, we believe.
Yeah, and it maybe it only did it for the Wuhan wave. Nobody seemed to have looked at it subsequently, but during the Wuhan wave, people who had mumps antibodies had very, very good protection. But there's all sorts of aspects to when we were talking about that sort of 10% are susceptible story. I think there are lots of different ways in which we're protected from infection, and we don't know which one of them is failing. So we're talking about antibodies as if that was the issue, but it may not have been that. So, for example, our respiratory tracts are lined with a mucus layer. In fact, it's layers of different types of mucus that they're lined by. And so if you are next to someone who's infected, or you've breathed it through the air, you've got a huge dose of virus in your air in your lung, that doesn't mean that you are going to be infected. Because if your mucus layer does its job properly, the virus cannot get into a cell. It just can't do that. So something else has to go wrong to allow the virus to penetrate, because that very last layer of mucus that sits right next to the cell is so thick that a single virus is too big to get through it. And the layers that are sort of more runny and above that layer are constantly being swept away up, and then we swallow it and it lands in the acid and it can't cause an infection. So something goes wrong with that mucus layer in some people, and we don't understand what it is. And if we could understand that, then that might teach us all sorts of other things around how the virus spreads and what you could do about it. So there's one interesting theory around how the virus can get through the mucus layer, which is that it hitchhikes on the back of a bacteria. And that's very, very interesting, because going back to Charles Chapin's time, they believed that influenza was spread by a bacteria called nowadays Haemophilus influenzae, which was not the cause of influenza, but they could find it in people who had influenza. Not every time, but they could find it, as if there was a relationship there between those organisms. And you see that, with influenza subsequently, that a lot of the problem with viral influenza is actually the bacteria that are hanging around at the same time, and you get these secondary bacterial infections, and that's why antibiotics have, been so important. And that's also why we have to be very concerned about how viral infection was treated during the course of 2020 onwards, because in the past, if you were sick in the community, you would see your doctor and they would greet you warmly with a smile, and then they would say, well, have a listen to your chest, you sound like you've got pneumonia, I'm going to give you antibiotics. I don't know what's caused your pneumonia, but this is the protocol, you get antibiotics. And the antibiotics these people have been given would have prevented these secondary bacterial infections, but they also had antiviral and anti-inflammatory properties, which would have benefited these people. And then on top of all of that, you've got the psychological benefit of being looked after and not being terrified. When people are terrified, their cortisol levels go up and everything goes south. So instead, we terrified people, told them, well, if you really must come to hospital, wait till you're blue in the face, and then we might look after you. And so, of course, all of that response is going to have had an impact on mortality from respiratory disease in that period, because we weren't treating it normally. There were reasons why we gave antibiotics for community pneumonia, even though some of those are viral in the past too.
It's just the antithesis of everything I've learnt and taught over the past 45 years in clinical work and educational work. This is exactly how we don't treat patients. Mm. Every first year student, look, listen, feel, tap. It's how you examine a patient. And if you can't, can you look on the phone? Maybe. You certainly can't listen. You certainly can't feel. You can't palpate, and you can't percuss them. The fundamental basics of any medical examination become impossible.
I agree, and that there is something about when you're in the room with the patient, face to face with them, you get a feel for how they're breathing, how they're holding themselves, how concerned they are, and that's not all from the words they're using. And the idea that they can give you that over a phone call, when the distance from a phone call creates a barrier that you don't have the trust there. It's not just the barrier in communication, the trust barrier gets broken as well. And so people don't get to share in the same way information that the doctor needs to know.
Yeah, when I retired from full-time education and went back to being a junior staff nurse on A&E, it was great. There was no emails and no meetings. But, by that time, I got a lifetime of experience. And some patients, you go into the cubicle and you think, I'm not happy with them at all. Might not quite know why.
Yeah.
And I would go to the consultant and say, I'm not happy with Mr. Smith there. And the consultants, to be fair, said, well, tell you what, John, they might not have said this, but this is what happened. If you're not happy, I'm not happy. And they would go and look at them.
Yeah.
And 9 times out of 10, there would be an unrecognised pneumonia, an unrecognised sepsis developing, an unrecognised stroke. There was something that you just get from your patient. And the idea that you just sweep all that aside, it reduces medicine to an artificial intelligence, not a human interaction.
Exactly that. I mean, that is the path that we've been travelling down more and more rapidly, but prior to COVID as well as recently, is this idea that doctors' decision making is algorithmic and protocol driven, and once you're there, you don't need doctors anymore. So doctors are doing themselves out of a job by pretending that these interpersonal skills, that the trust, and that these signals, this pattern recognition, this the kind of thing that you can't quite put words to feed into an algorithm, don't count for anything, and they do. And moreover, the doctors have a very, very important role as being ethical and being able to look at the patient in front of them at the time and be an advocate for that patient's needs at that time, which will not necessarily fit with any algorithm or protocol, because everybody's unique, and people need to be treated as unique, because otherwise they just get mashed through a machine.
And as well as that, you mentioned that this immense placebo effect, which we must never underestimate, that when you're with your doctor who you trust, just the way they put the stethoscope on your chest, it just gives that confidence. You can feel their competence. I often used to be the patient for things like trauma courses, and the sometimes you get junior doctors holding your head, when I was pretending to be the patient. And one day there was a consultant orthopedic surgeon doing the teaching, and the way he held my head, I could just tell this guy was a superb clinician, just the way he was touching me. And it was you think, oh, this is fine, I'm in good hands here.
Literally.
Yeah, literally. But the massive, and the doctor will just look at you and oh yes, that looks all right. And if it's someone you trust, that the massive positive placebo effect from that. And of course, what we got through the pandemic was a massive nocebo effect as well.
Yeah, well, the doctors are frightened of seeing you. Yeah. How well am I if they won't even see me because I'm so deadly sick?
Therefore, I'm probably going to die.
Yeah.
And that can become this idea that you believe you will makes you will, and it's true.
Yeah. It's true. We also had the additional problem of people treating people as numbers. And, everybody got very obsessed with the pulse oximeters on the end of the finger, which I think have a role to play, and I think have been actually very important in hospital care. But we've never actually tried using them in the community for chest infections to know what normal looks like. We don't know what normal looks like. And we started to say, well, if it's dipping to 85 or below 90, you need to come in. And I'm not sure that that's right. It might have been. But we don't have that control group to say, actually, when people have chest infections and when they're having coughing fits, it will dip and it will come back up. And as long as it's coming back up, you don't need to be in hospital.
Yeah, we slavishly follow British Thoracic Society guidelines on that. And they need to be... Well, basically, all this stuff needs to go through the mind of a clinician, doesn't it? But you're right. We need to collect data on this and work out what is normal.
Yeah.
Because very often we don't know the difference between physiology and pathology. Sometimes the line is blurred. And
we had that sort of expression of, well, they've got happy hypoxia. Do you remember that term?
Yeah. And
you think, well, if they're that happy, why are you treating the hypoxia? And they'll think, well, because they might crash at any time, it's all going to be a disaster, and this is what this illness looked like. So it's not like any other pneumonia you've ever seen before. And maybe they were right. But I think there's a room for a little bit of doubt there that was the best way to go about things. Because once you've told somebody that thing on your finger tells you that you're dying and you need to come into hospital, then you are sort of setting them up for failure a bit.
Yeah, you're setting up for the nocebo effect potentially.
Yeah.
So I'm going to wrap this up shortly, Claire, but this mumps, at the start of the pandemic, there could have been massive efficacy in isolating the mumps component of the MMR, giving that to people, and that would have generated significant levels of protection, as far as we understand, against COVID. Am I overstating the case?
I don't think you're overstating the case, and I think that definitely looked like a promising route to have tried as a vaccine in a situation where we had evidence of that vaccine from before.
Yeah, and of course, the mumps vaccine, we're giving a precise known dose of antigen. We're not giving an RNA instruction. We're not giving an adenovirus vector instruction. We are actually giving the antigen in a totally controlled, precise measure, so we know exactly what we're getting. We give the right dose of the right drug to the right patient, to the right route at the right time. And it's a pity that wasn't perhaps considered more.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always been this thing where Government seems to like to throw its money behind innovation. They can say, well, we're doing something new, and it means that not only are we solving a problem, but we're also potentially investing in a way that could solve other problems in the future. And I think that there are occasions when that thinking is just ridiculous and detrimental, because there are times when actually it pays to stick with what we know. And this was exactly what happened in the swine flu pandemic back in 2009, where the decision was that we needed a vaccine, and that the vaccine could not be a conventional influenza vaccine grown in eggs. It had to be something novel. And it turned out that the conventional influenza vaccine grown in eggs was ready at exactly the same time as these novel things. So the claim was it would take too long, but it was ready at the same time. But they went with something novel, and the consequence was about 100 teenagers in this country got narcolepsy, which meant the sleep centers of their brain were permanently damaged, and they could fall asleep or go into a sleep-like paralysis while conscious at any time for the rest of their lives. So hugely disabling. And it probably didn't actually have any benefit for swine flu either. The Swedish public health official, I can't remember exactly what her role was, but she reckoned that it saved 6 lives in Sweden as a max. How ridiculous. You've caused all this harm and you didn't really make a difference.
The arrogance of not learning from that mistake is just stunning.
Indeed. Yeah.
And I like the saying, if it ain't bust, don't fix it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Claire, we have more to do. If you would like to, the next questions would be, which we're not going to do now, but COVID would likely kill me, ? Death certificates are never wrong, ? A new variant spells doom, ? If you test positive, you have COVID.
Yeah, there's a lot to say on that. ?
1 in 3 people with COVID spread it while asymptomatic, ?
Mm-hmm.
Lockdowns save lives, ? Lockdowns are not harmful, ? Masks reduce transmission. I think we've already given a spoiler on that one, but children are resilient, and zero COVID is achievable. So that's still to come. In the meantime, do get this. You won't be able to put it down. It's just makes sense of everything. And as indeed as this discussion helped massively, Claire. So thank you so much. We've been going for an hour and 23 minutes, so you've done very well. And if you'd like to come back to discuss those future questions, we will be absolutely delighted.
Absolutely,
but for now,
I'd love to. Thanks, John.
For now, Dr. Clare Craig, pathologist, doctor, researcher, author, and campaigner for the good of humanity, thank you very much.
Thank you, John.